Dr. Glenn,
Yes.
today we're talking about imposter syndrome.
Just own that we're all imposters. End of the episode.
End of the episode.
Done.
Done. Period. Now, we have some solid tips and some guidance. This is actually a subject that I feel like I know quite well because I often feel it.
Oh, me too, for sure.
Yeah. Okay. So we're going to dive straight into this, starting with welcome to 12-Week Relationships. This is your place for better relationships in weeks, not years. And when we say relationships, we mean all of them, including the one with yourself and then working outward from there. And that's what we're talking about today. By the way, my name is Pye and this
I'm Dr. Glenn.
is Dr. Glenn. So today is all about the relationship that we have with ourselves and specifically speaking on imposter syndrome.
Yeah,
dude.
it's a good topic, man.
This is a really good one. I mean, especially for creatives and artists. And I don't know, I feel like we all feel this, but if you're an entrepreneur, if you're a creative, if you are doing something that's kind of off the beaten path, you know this one well.
If you're doing anything meaningful, you're going to feel this no matter what.
I like that.
Yeah.
I like that. I know this one well because I don't feel like imposter syndrome ever goes away.
Yeah, I don't think so either, because I think it's if you take the feeling away and if you take the negative view of it, it's just a sign that you're growing and you need to open yourself up more.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I get this quite a bit. I talked to Goalie about this on the 12EQ podcast. I talked about, I still have imposter syndrome constantly. And I think sometimes people are surprised to hear that. But to me, it's not that surprising, number one. I don't think there's any getting over it, because if you are self-aware, then I think there's always going to be this mechanism of sort of questioning yourself and making sure that what you're doing is valid and worthwhile. But I also think that there's two sides to imposter syndrome. I think there's the truthful, logical aspect of imposter syndrome that can be addressed through work, external work, like action-oriented. And then I think there's the other side, the emotional side of imposter syndrome, that's really about the personal work. And that's what we're going to get into in this episode, right?
Yeah, and I think, as you bring up a good point. I think it's being honest about it versus trying to just deny that it's not there.
Yeah.
And then sweeping it under the rug. Oh, no, I'm a good person. And trying to just, reduce it to that versus like, no, go there, explore your feelings, explore your thoughts, and do good with it.
Yeah, that's one of the, I guess, frustrating things that I notice when it comes to talking about this is people will just say, don't feel like an imposter. Oh, you should get out there and do this. You go, girl. You got this. Like it's almost like to ignore the feeling. And in my mind, it's more like actually imposter syndrome is a good thing. Like that means that you're self-aware. It also means that there's something there that can be addressed. And if you were to ignore it completely, that's what, in my opinion, leads to not so great products and services and work and all that kind of stuff.
And to me, it's a sign that you're going in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
You're challenging yourself, as scary as it is, and good things are going to come out of it. You're going to learn about yourself.
That's a good one. Because you wouldn't feel imposter syndrome in areas that you don't really, in something that you have mastered or you've gained mastery of, you're not going to feel imposter syndrome. And at the same time, there's not really the room to grow in that area. Maybe there's small improvements and whatnot, but it's not going to be something completely new, right?
No, agree. So if it's within your wheelhouse, you're not going to feel like an imposter. You'll be like, oh, I already know how to do this, versus challenging yourself and growing.
I love that, bro.
Thanks, man.
See, that's awesome.
Thanks, man.
Because again, that ties back to that feeling is a positive thing. Mm-hmm. It's a good thing that you feel that you're in a place and in a position where you're doing something that's going to help you to grow dramatically.
And then just looking at it from the perspective of am an imposter because I'm chartering into this new territory, which I have no identity at this point.
Yeah. Okay, this one's going to be fun. So they're all going to be, they've all been, well, there's 2 episodes that were not so fun.
The ones that were very personal. I remember those.
Those got deep. Those, not so much fun. But talking first about the logical side of imposter syndrome, I like this side of it because, so just defining this real quick, I'm saying that the logical side of imposter syndrome is like, there's a reason that you feel, maybe as a photographer, you just got into photography and you don't feel like you're creating that good of work, and you're kind of like, self-conscious about the work that you're putting out because it's not that good. Like you see what's being put out and you know that your quality's not quite there yet, this is the logical piece of that, right? The not so logical, the emotional aspect of that imposter syndrome is the unnecessary comparisons to others and where I should be and these high expectations of yourself and letting yourself down. And it's the emotional components that make us dive inwards. So I kind of wanted to talk about the logical piece first.
Mm-hmm.
We're both like,
Yeah, we touched.
we just touched.
High five.
Is that a
fist bump? Fist bump.
What is it when you touch toes? It's not a moon landing. Moon landing is butts.
I don't know. Toe touch.
Okay, we're not going to do a moon landing. I
don't think people want to see that.
I thought of that when like our feet like just kind of connected.
Sweet,
right there.
Man. Okay. Awesome.
So going to this logical piece, we gave the photographer example, right? Like it makes sense. You're new to this. You haven't yet established yourself. That is something that can be addressed through outward actions. I'm going to give you another example. Me jumping into this space or even writing this book on relationships. The very first editor that I had read it goes, you need to stop apologizing. I wasn't apologizing directly, but it was like indirectly for my lack of qualifications. I would kind of say things like, look, I kind of have no business writing this book. And I did still leave a piece of that in there in terms of, it's a joke. You know, I'm not a psychologist. I'm not, formally trained and whatnot. So I think that's worth pointing out and making a joke out of. But she was detecting this lack of confidence throughout all of my phrasing and wording and things. And she goes, you need to stop. Like, you know a lot about this. Stop. I had this issue with you too.
No, I brought it up. I go, man, you're so well researched and there's so much good information in there. It's like you've been studying this for years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's amazing work.
But for me, the root of that imposter syndrome is again, something that is a big piece of it is actionable, right? Because what I'm really thinking to myself is, I'm not a doctor. I am not formally trained in psychology. And so there needs to be, I can do other things to make up for this, but I have to make up for it in some way. So how could I do that? Well, I can put out lots of great resources and education and just let my work kind of speak for itself. And once I develop a name and reputation for it, that alleviates that, right? I could go to school and get the degree if I needed that piece of paper to validate it. But there's outward actions that can be done to solve that problem. Just like on the photographer side. The photographer can focus on his or her craft to alleviate the quality issue, that logical piece of imposter syndrome.
No, I mean, I felt the same way working with you because you're so successful in business and branding and all of these things. So I had no idea what to expect. So I always felt kind of an imposter all the time.
In terms of business.
In terms of business and then the structure and the setup. And you had so much knowledge. So I was always like humbling myself and being like, oh, this is awesome. I get to learn more about it. But there's always that imposter syndrome inside of me.
Yeah, that was honestly one of the ways that I addressed my imposter syndrome when it came to the book and to this entire platform and concept was, okay, I have now found a doctor of psychology, someone with clinical experience, someone who is currently a working professor at a college who believes in it, who understands it, and is able to actually back it up with all the academic research to do this. That was a huge piece of addressing that side of it for me, was like, okay, now I've addressed that piece. The rest of the work now becomes internal, right? It becomes like, I need to do personal work on the rest of the imposter syndrome.
No, it's same thing with me. Like learning from, like, I know someone that's so good at what they do. And, I get to be a part of this and be on this journey to grow and expand.
Yeah.
I felt exactly the same way.
Yeah, so that's the piece that like I don't like it when people ignore it or say just like, don't listen to the imposter syndrome because you're identifying a weakness.
Well, when you shared about like the book and you're like, man, I don't have the degrees. Like, remember like when you're asking me about like my business background?
Yeah.
I was like, oh, I did some stuff, right?
Yeah.
So I felt exactly the same way because I felt like I should be able to share like, man, I had all these successful sales and did all these crazy things, but that wasn't the truth.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I really, wanted to learn and grow in this field, and you were an expert in your craft.
Yeah. So in that way, we kind of both, from the standpoint of business, you're able to deal with that imposter syndrome. Like, I have no clue what I'm doing in business or selling or doing any of this stuff by simply partnering with someone that's competent in this area. And similarly, all the research and everything that I've put together is then, justified and supported by your academic experience and experience in the field. So there's so many different creative ways of actually addressing that logical piece of imposter syndrome, meaning the piece that you should have. Like if you are self-aware, you kind of should be questioning yourself at times. Maybe you want to be a photographer, but my work's not that good yet. I shouldn't charge this much money. Okay, if that's how you feel. Now, there are some people that feel that their work isn't good yet because of perfectionism. We're going to get into that in just a second.
Mm-hmm.
But there's another group that they recognize that they're not quite there yet. That can be addressed. Put time into education, into practicing, into test shoots, into everything you need to do. Same thing as a writer. You doubt your ability to write.
That's okay.
That's okay.
You do the work.
Yeah, every day, sit down, spend an hour doing it. Eventually, the skill is going to make up for the logical piece of imposter syndrome. So what about the emotional piece? What is that?
Well, I think it just comes from like self-doubt and then not believing that you're able to do it. And there's some truth there. If you haven't done it yet, there's going to be doubt there.
Mm-hmm.
And then below that, I think is maybe like deeper rooted personal issues that you have to address and work out. Like if there's really like self-esteem issues or, I'm not a good person issues, those are going to come out when you're being challenged at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So it's dealing with both of those layers.
Yeah. Okay. All this is to say imposter syndrome.
And don't overcompensate.
Mm-hmm.
Like, don't try to act like you're bigger than you are to address the imposter syndrome.
That's a big one.
Right? Because what if I was like, oh yeah, I did all these successful sales, Pye, look, and then you find out like I didn't.
Yeah.
That's going to hurt the relationship.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. As soon as you try to cover up something. Okay. The people if you have imposter syndrome, I genuinely don't worry.
Embrace
this
it.
is a good thing.
It's a healthy thing.
Don't have imposter syndrome. If you think what you're doing is always awesome, I am badass through and through. I can't think of a single person that thinks that who actually does high quality work.
Yeah, I mean, there's some outliers.
There's some outliers.
But for the most part, yeah, like is basically just average. Like most people that think that they're the shit, their work is just average.
Yeah.
It's just very basic.
Because
it's not even that great.
You lack the ability to self-critique. So like while we're looking at imposter syndrome and saying that this is something negative, which we're saying it's not, it's positive. But when you're looking at it and saying that this is negative, you're literally criticizing the ability to actually improve, to critique yourself and improve.
Well, I see it in school all the time. Like the student that is neurotic and that's always doubting him or herself,
Mm-hmm.
their quality of work is like at the highest level.
Yeah.
And then you have the person that they're always giving their comments thinking that everything they say is so important and so great. And, oh, my paper's so awesome. And then they get like a C. Like they're just average. It's okay.
Timmy, did you write this paper? And Timmy's like, hell yeah, I did. My name's on it.
Yeah.
And you're like, Timmy, this paper was garbage.
Like, I'm glad you like yourself. So, but this paper sucked.
Yeah.
Versus the other person, like they're just doing immense, incredible work because they're on this path to growth.
Okay. So first, stop worrying that you have this feeling.
Embrace
it's a positive thing.
Embrace it.
Once you have gone to work toward the piece of this that is kind of outward actions, right? That's what we're defining as the logical side. The logical reason why you feel this way is because there's something that's not quite there yet, and you need to put those pieces into play, right? Then you put those pieces into play, and you still have doubts. Yeah. Now what we're talking about is this is our own personal experiences, our own past trauma, our own past everything that's kind of boiling up and creating insecurities that we then have to do personal work to address. And one of the first tips that you gave for this was to reframe self-doubt. And you actually said into being more open. Can you explain that?
Yeah. So usually when fear comes, people try to contract and they try to find some sense of certainty and they'll do like all these little mantras and like, oh, I'm good enough. And they try to reduce their feelings versus I'm scared because this is new to me. I need to open myself even more and be available to whatever it is that I need to do.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So whenever the fear and the self-doubt comes in, instead of like seeing it as bad and trying to push it down, it's like, man, this is awesome. I'm scared because something new is about to happen for me.
It's essentially the first kind of piece that we opened up with, right? The recognizing that the feeling is a good thing.
Yeah, and then you don't have to reframe it or try to make it, one of the things that people say is fear is false expectation appearing real. Like
False expectation
it's
appearing
all
real.
right. Like, I
It's a
mean,
nice acronym.
yeah, like it's all right, but you're basically saying like, oh, the fear is irrational versus like, no, it's rational because this is new to me.
Yeah.
So it's just not giving it more power than it is other than I'm nervous because this is new and so I embrace it.
Yeah. It's not life or death.
It's
So
not life or death.
responding to fear as if it's life or death is irrational.
Or
But
trying to make it go away.
yeah.
Or trying to downplay it. It's like, no, this is how I feel because this is new.
Yeah. The
Period.
feeling is valid.
Period. Yeah.
Stew in it.
Stew in
Accept
it. Stay in it. The self-doubt, that's good, man. It's keeping me open. The doubt is keeping me open.
Now people are going to be like, I'm just going to sit and bathe in my self-doubt. That's not what we want either.
It's just recognizing that it's there because it's new.
Yeah.
That's it.
Okay. So then the next piece of this is going to be getting rid of unhealthy comparisons, right? Because I'm careful on this one because there's such a thing as a healthy and an unhealthy comparison.
Correct. So like, for example, like when we started working together, if I just compared myself to all the things that you've accomplished, like I'm gonna hate myself. I'm gonna be eating Doritos and Oreos in bed all day, right?
Well, that's very kind of you to say.
No, it's true though.
Thank you.
So I had to like look at like, okay, this is where I'm kind of aspiring. Like you're a master in your craft, so I'm so excited to learn. But I had to compare myself in terms of like the starting point, looking at other people that are starting out as well. So that became my comparative in terms of where I'm at in my own personal journey.
Yeah. From the creative aspect, you see that comparison constantly. Social media makes it worse in a lot of ways. I mean, it's such a powerful tool to be able to show your work and to share your work, but then a lot of creatives and entrepreneurs and people that are showing their work and their services and what they do get lost in following and looking at what other people are doing to the point where it's almost crippling. Like you'll look through and just keep scanning and oh my gosh, this person's doing this and they're doing that and it's so much better than mine, and that is a very unhealthy version of comparison.
Yeah, I think it's looking at this is where I aspire to be, but then still, understanding like this is where I'm at though at the same time. So I have to look at comparatives in relation to where I'm starting out.
Yeah, that to me is the healthy versus unhealthy. See, I like comparing, but I like to compare apples to apples, right? I think it's worthwhile to always keep an eye out and to say, hey, someone with my level of experience and with the quality of stuff that I'm doing, what does their work look like? Whatever that might be, right? Whether we're talking about like a coaching program or whether we're talking about photography or just a business service, that's healthy to compare like apples to apples. It's not healthy to ask yourself, why is my work shit? And so, who's been doing this 20 years, is on top of the world. That is completely unhealthy.
Yeah. And then you're like, oh, I should be there, but then you're not there.
No.
And then you're just going to feel like, man, then it's not even worth trying. I don't even want to do this anymore.
Yeah.
I'm such a loser. And then you just start spiraling down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's incredibly crippling to do this because as an artist, again, we can take this into any realm, right? But when you make those comparisons, you're going to feel so behind in the process that you not only lose sight of kind of, there's a joy in picking up something and being new and learning something, right? You lose sight of that. You lose sight of this journey and this process, but then you also lose your motivation because you're never going to be where you think you should be. And it happens in all these different arenas. I told you I'm going to be taking us to jiu-jitsu quite often. Okay. So going to the mats, going to jiu-jitsu, I haven't rolled that long, 16 months. Okay. Still a white belt, an advanced white belt, but I'll have people come in and be there a month and get frustrated that they can't beat me or pass my guard or do whatever they want to do. And I'm like, look, dude, I've been doing this, 16 months. How do you think I feel if I were to take that same approach and look at my professor who's been doing it 30 years? I can't do anything. Like when my professor and I roll, it's like he's surfing on top of me. That's what it feels like. It's just like, I can
looks
move
like
in
slow motion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like slow motion surfing over my body. Whatever I do, whatever I twist, anything. And if I'm going to sit there and go, man, I'm not at his level, I'm going to get so discouraged and disappointment. And I'm going to forget the joy of like to me, things are exciting and they're fun when they're new and they're fresh and there's that huge opportunity for growth. So I'm not only going to miss that, but then I'm probably going to quit. And people do. They quit because they have these unrealistic expectations, these comparisons that don't make sense. And they'll leave photography because after 6 months, they're not successful. They'll leave jiu-jitsu because after a month, they can't beat who they wanted to beat. It doesn't matter. It's very unhealthy to our individual health, the mental health that's needed to continue with something.
Yeah, once again, it's got to be healthy comparisons, meaning that if you're a month in, you can't compare yourself to a person that's been doing it 20 years. Even 16 months, it's got to be month to month. Like, who are the students that are new? And then how am I doing in comparison to them? And how am I progressing? That's a more feasible way, and that's a more motivating way to work your way up.
Yeah, and even getting deeper, like, what are my goals versus theirs? What is my age versus theirs? What am I trying to do? Because those matter too, right? Like, if we go back to the idea of, like, let's say, I don't know, let's talk about a photographer or a cinematographer or whatever it is that you want to be creatively, right? You go back to that, and let's say that your goal is just to make a little bit of extra income every month. You just want to do it part-time because you have a full-time job that you enjoy. And the other person's goal is full-time, and they eventually go full-time and they're working, and this is their craft, 40, 50, 60 hours a week, right? That again is not a fair comparison, even if you started at the same time, because one person has completely different goals and they're putting 60 hours a week into this, and the other is just doing it for kind of a side thing, a side gig.
No, agreed. And then if you're like, oh, my 15 hours compared to this 60 hours, look at how much better they're doing. That's a ridiculous comparison.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you have to be very realistic about what you're trying to accomplish.
And to take that a step further too, to show the detriment of that comparison, I'm going to give you an example from the photography world where one of the people that I have consulted with was saying that in my area, there's this other person that does about the same quality of work that I do, but they charge $5,000 per shoot, and I'm only charging $2,500 per shoot. And I go, but does that person actually shoot a lot? And they go, I don't know. And I go, so you've only compared price points between the two, but you have no information on, like, how often they're shooting, how often they're working. The person goes onto that guy's blog, right? And on the blog, there's a post every few months, right? But the person that's making the comparison is working all the time. See, they're doing $2,500 shoots, but they're fully booked and they're shooting every single week.
So they're actually doing better.
But not only that, when they were comparing, they didn't realize that the other person actually had a full-time job, and they're charging $5,000 because they're only going to take on 2 or 3 jobs a year. So I'm just going to charge that and leave everything else.
And that works for them.
But the comparison was so inaccurate.
Yeah. So that's why any unhealthy comparisons will lead to imposter syndrome.
Yes.
Yeah. Bottom line.
Bottom line. So that was number 2, get rid of our unhealthy comparisons. Number 3 we had was redefine perfectionism. I love what you said on this.
Yeah. So perfectionism, like if you look at like older studies, it's based off of low self-esteem and you're trying to be everything to everybody. But there's actually like newer studies that show that perfectionism is actually based off of high self-esteem. Because if you really think about it, if you think that you can be everything to everybody, never really make mistakes, that's a grandiose level of self-esteem, that you really believe in yourself, that I can make all of you happy and myself happy at the same time. So addressing perfectionism in that viewpoint, you can tell yourself, if I'm trying to be perfect all the time, I must humble myself down and just be more of a human being.
That is so incredibly accurate.
Right? So you can view it in 2 ways, right? You can view it as like, I just have really low self-esteem, so I'm trying to prove my worth. Or I really believe in myself to the point of grandiosity, so I got to tone my expectations down about myself. I got to humble myself a little bit.
I find that, at least anecdotally, from my perspective, you're exactly right. I am very much a perfectionist, and it's not because I have low self-worth. It's because I think very highly of myself. And it's like, calm down, Pye. You just started in jiu-jitsu. Or calm down, Pye. You're kind of new to this whole podcast thing. I know that you've done some other stuff before, but this is new. But I constantly have that. And you're 1000% right that it's not coming from a place of like low self-worth. It's coming from a place of like, dude,
delusional self-worth.
Get off your high horse.
Yeah. So if you view perfectionism that way, it's less threatening. And it's like, oh, okay, cool. Like I just got to humble myself.
Yeah.
Right? Like just don't be don't believe in myself as much as I do right now.
Fascinating.
Yeah, and actually, like working
Don't
with
believe in myself as much. So on the one hand, we're like,
this is another topic, but self-esteem, like if we cover like research on self-esteem and you look at self-esteem and achievement,
yeah,
the higher the self-esteem, usually the lower the achievement.
that's
And then
wild.
on the flip side, the lower the self-esteem, the higher the achievement. But this has nothing to do with happiness. Like if you flip it, like high self-esteem equals happier,
Yeah.
but it doesn't equate to achievement and success in life. On the flip side, low self-esteem can lead to higher achievement, but it doesn't mean that you're happier as a person.
So what you're saying is, as a parent, I must
It's
balance
balancing it out.
making my children feel like shit and,
It's balancing out like
giving them
work,
some
work
sense of-
and identity.
okay.
Like, that's it. We can go with it. There's like a Dutch study, but basically like if you raise kids to be more communal focused versus identity focused, like individually focused,
Yeah.
they work harder. They're actually more humble, and then they're more diligent in what they do, when they grow up, versus if you raise them to be this kind of like high self-esteem individual. You're amazing. Look at how you threw out that trash. Oh my God. The way you comb and eat that food, that's amazing, right? And you build up their self-esteem. They're going to be less motivated, and then their coping skills to deal with the difficulties of life goes down.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. So the whole perfectionist mindset from that standpoint, like even Freud talked about perfectionism. He's like, you're thinking too much of yourself.
Yeah.
You're too delusional. So humble yourself down. You're just a human being like everyone else, and just do what you need to do.
I mean, so much of what we're talking about is that balance, right? I mean, we're talking about imposter syndrome and saying, don't throw it out. It's a good thing, but don't also lean into it and fall into the traps of it. There's this healthy medium, right? And you're saying the same thing in terms of like perfectionism. It's having a good self-worth is important, but then it's also possible to think so much of yourself that you're narcissistic and you can't really appropriately self-analyze in any of these situations. And it's also possible to be on the flip side where you have no self-esteem whatsoever and you're constantly just wading in this pool of self-doubt.
Exactly. So it's finding that middle ground and redefining what healthy mental health is, which is feeling fear, feeling doubt, but yet feeling excited and hopeful and taking account all of your strengths and weaknesses. That is being healthy in terms of your overall well-being, versus like those people that are absolute lead, follow, and get out of the way. I'm direct and decisive. Is that really high self-esteem? Is that really being healthy?
Yeah. What would that pool of self-doubt look like, Glenn?
For me personally, Oreos and pizza.
That's a very literal pool of self-doubt.
On the bed. Like, oh.
I saw you wading that pool just a couple nights ago.
Yeah, man.
Yeah, man. Deep.
Deep, man. Deep.
Okay. I like that. I wasn't thinking, I thought you might say like, oh, it's like a pool in the middle of a desert with black water.
Self-doubt?
And you're the only person.
A pool, but it's also...
But it's Oreos and milk for you.
It's Oreos and milk for me, but it's a healthy place to go. Like instead of seeing it as dangerous, because there's like a resistance to go there.
Which specific place? Oreos and milk? What place is safe
the
to
self-doubt, the whole
okay,
self-doubt.
Okay. Not wading in the pool, though.
Not
we don't
wading
want you to wade in the self-doubt
But
pool.
even if you go in the pool, then the pool, you'll suck it out. It'll go away.
I'm going to suck up all the black water in the desert.
It's that Bruce Lee saying, to find safety, you must enter the heart of danger, right? So you embrace your emotional danger points, right? Where the self-doubt is, where it's coming from, and you actually go there. It takes all the danger feelings away.
I think I love you more for two reasons. Number one, I like quotes a lot. But number two, that was from Bruce Lee.
That was from Bruce Lee.
Say that again.
To find safety, you must enter the heart of danger.
Fascinating.
So like, in your emotional world.
Decode that right now.
Because he always believed in like when you fight, you don't find out the person that you know you can beat. You must always find the person that can beat you.
Interesting.
And then that's emotional safety for him, because I'm learning a new skill set. I'm going into this unknown place. That's the heart of danger. That's actually safe.
Yeah.
Right?
To pull this back to imposter syndrome, the way that I feel today when it comes to, like, in my opinion, it never goes away, right? But today, my imposter syndrome feels very different than it did 10 years ago. A decade ago at the beginning of this whole journey, it could be debilitating, like when this kind of comes over me, right? But then having gone through those challenges, having waded into the so-called dangers of entrepreneurial life and unknown and all this kind of stuff. And you go through these experiences and you come out successful. And yeah, now I feel imposter syndrome, but it's a manageable feeling that guides me towards what I need to be doing. And it's not debilitating anymore. So there's comfort. I don't know that it ever goes away, but at the same time, it definitely feels different and it's much more manageable as you go.
But it's the work through, like you're doing the work and you're being introspective.
Yeah.
And then you're focusing on all of your emotional states. And that's what helps you break through.
Yeah. Because like you say, in terms of like Bruce Lee was relating this to finding an opponent that is stronger and faster and better. And then if you can overcome that challenge, then there's a different level of comfort and security and safety that comes with that, right? Because if I can handle this, I can handle anything.
And that becomes a norm.
Mm-hmm.
That becomes a norm in your life. That actually feels safer than just feeling literally safe because you're not doing anything.
Yeah.
That actually becomes scary.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then, even through this process of building this up, that fear, that excitement of the unknown and building something, that has become normal for me.
Mm-hmm.
So the imposter syndrome is more great. Like, let's see what happens now.
Yeah. I have a little tip to insert into here because we're going to get to the next one. Your number 4 was to stop trying to seek out external validation. And I like that one a lot, but I want to insert a 3.5.
Do it.
Or a 4 before you're 4. Okay. One of the things that I was going to say is when it comes to this whole idea of, imposter syndrome, it's really important that we're careful who we surround ourselves with because, and more specifically, who we choose to share our ideas with, right? I'm very particular when I have an idea that's kind of budding, something that I'm not quite comfortable with yet. I don't know if I'm going to do it. I don't know if I'm going to pursue it, but I'm feeling it out. There are very few people that I'll tell about it. Literally probably 2 or 3. One would be actually there's only one that I go to first, and that's Yen. So my partner. The second one would be either you or Justin or Chris. But even at that point, I want to make sure my idea is more fleshed out than whatever it was, right? The concept, the thing that I'm going to present in front of. So Yen's kind of the first point where I'm comfortable sharing anything. But then even that second layer, these next 3 people that I'm closest to, I'm very cautious because I know that imposter syndrome that I have with a new idea, with a new concept. It's always going to be stronger at the beginning, the formation of this new thing that you want to be doing, right? And if you take those ideas and you share them with people too quickly, then their doubts and their experiences and their fears are going to quickly make it so that you stop. You basically give in and you stop pursuing this thing. Now, it's not to say that, by the time that I get to that second layer, when I'm explaining something to you or Justin or Chris, usually it's something that like, okay, now I've done some research on, I've done some, this is what this would look like, this is this. And then it's allowing you guys to see where are the holes in this idea, But I have to control each layer of this. When I announce something publicly, I know that I'm sticking with it. When it goes up onto social, I know that I'm going to do this thing. It can fail. It's either going to fail miserably and I'm going to be this, comet that burns out in the sky that everyone can see, or it's going to be successful. But I'm okay with either option.
But like the example that you gave, as you're going through your steps with like Yan and then like Justin and Chris and me, is your imposter syndrome is coming from the high expectations that you have of yourself.
Yeah.
And trying to be as successful as possible. And that's why you're taking all these necessary steps to do your due diligence to finally present what it is that you're going to present.
Yeah.
So it comes from the high expectations that you have.
True. It also comes from like when these ideas are just, it's like a seedling. I mean, you can't grab a seedling and it sprouts one little thing and then go and throw it into a winter weather. It's going to die. So it's kind of, for me, it's like it's letting the seedling germinate a bit and getting some, strength around it, presenting it to Yen and seeing like, what are, these things. And then if it continues to grow, then taking it beyond that place and kind of letting it get tested. And by the time that I put it out into the world, that's the time where I'm good, whether it grows into a tree or whether it fails.
But let me ask you a question. So using that example, let's say you had lower expectations of life. Do you think you'd have an imposter syndrome then if you went through the same sequence?
No, because I do believe that what you're saying, like, all of this, the way that I approach this has to do with the fact that I do have
Very
high
high,
self-worth and
high
high
expectations.
expectations.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I approach it. But knowing this and knowing that I do get imposter syndrome and knowing that this is something that I'm never going to like be over, this is one step that I use to kind of control it is like, if I don't have a good idea of something yet, I'm not going to present it to everybody yet. And I think that's important. Like when you have an idea that's just budding, do the work, spend some time on it.
Mm-hmm.
Like let it move around, let it like feel it out. Don't go just pitching it to everybody and showing it to everybody. And then because they're going to shit on it. That's kind of just what happens to things when people have doubts. And then you end up being discouraged and dropping it.
No, I totally get that, but that's beyond imposter syndrome. That's just being prepared.
Maybe.
Yeah, like I think that's just a testament to you and your desire to be really successful and doing your due diligence. I mean, I think there's some imposter syndrome in there with the expectations, but that's more about like you just being a hard worker and dedicated.
To me, it kind of fits. It's one and the same. And I'll tell you why. I wrote this book on relationships, right? I knew in writing the book that I felt like, number one, what business did I have writing this book? This isn't the space that I'm known for, right? So in knowing that and in feeling that imposter syndrome, when I was writing the book, I never went to Justin and Chris was like, hey, I'm going to write a book. What do you guys think? I just did it. In my own free time, I spent the time to actually write it and to research and to do, I already had the research and the data, but I spent the time to actually piece this thing together and then when I had a book, then I presented it and said, I've written a book. Over the past 2 years, I've written this book. Take a look. Tell me what you think. Then it comes down to, at that point, they go, yeah, but Pye, you've written this book, but nobody knows who you are in this space. And I go, these are the steps of how I'm going to get to that place, right? But my imposter syndrome led me to kind of know that had I pitched this idea early on when nothing was there, I probably would have been discouraged enough to not do it at all. So I just held it and waited for a time when, I mean, to me, that's one and the same thing, is it not?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, like when you tell the story, like just hearing it again, like it's just courage. Like it's not even being an imposter, it's just being courageous. And maybe that's what it is. Instead of imposter syndrome, it's the courageous syndrome. Like you're taking steps beyond yourself, and it's a courageous thing to do.
I mean, that's the reframing though, right? That's your whole premise of reframing this entire concept of us saying that, imposter syndrome can be positive. There's good aspects of it and not so good.
But what I'm saying is like you're a person that, you have high self-esteem, you're very driven, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think if the imposter syndrome that you have is more reflective of the fact that it's coming from a very good place. And I think that applies to most people.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's coming from a good place versus like, oh, I'm really an imposter and I'm just not worthy and good enough.
Yes. But the difference that you see in that, I think, is just due to experience. Because what I'm saying is that the only reason that I'm able to continue past it now, it's not because I don't have imposter syndrome. It's just because I've learned how to work through it, right? What I'm saying is when you're early in this process and you haven't yet worked through these ideas and you haven't gone through this, your imposter syndrome is going to be stronger. You're
I see what you're saying. So
you're weaker.
When you first wrote the book and you were starting out, the imposter syndrome was at its greatest
Yes.
at that moment
Yes.
versus now.
Yes.
When you're presenting ideas, the imposter syndrome is much, much less.
Correct. So I'm saying that if you're a, budding photographer, if you're a budding cinematographer, a painter, a musician,
it's going to be
at
real
the
strong.
inception, it's going to be
Very
incredibly strong. So instead of telling your friends, I'm going to become a musician and go record an album, just silently go and record your first song and then your second, create your album, and then be like, I made a CD. Check it out.
Mm-hmm.
People don't do CDs anymore. I just dated myself. But that's what I'm saying, is that early on in any of these adventures and journeys, that's when your imposter syndrome is greatest. So for me, a tip that's always helped is hold these things close to the chest until those seedlings have grown enough that they can withstand a bit of storm.
But that's just good advice in general. Like, even if you're successful, you want to be selective of who you share things with.
Sure.
And if they understand too. So I think that's just a good thing to do in general.
Sure. I just thought it related to him.
It did. It totally did. Yeah.
It's okay to disagree. Agree to disagree.
That was another podcast.
That was another podcast.
Yeah.
People are like, everyone, I get all these messages. They're like, Pye, I really like your voice. But then when I do my different voices, they might not enjoy it anymore. It's okay. Agree to disagree. Don't do those voices, Pye. Okay. So let's go into the next piece then, which was to not seek out external validation. Oh, this is such a tough one, dude.
It's hard. So when you're trying, especially if you're in this comparative mindset and you're always comparing yourself to others, that's always looking for external means versus your own personal growth, your own personal journey, knowing where you're at and just seeing where you are and where you've been, and just keep like chugging along.
Oh, this one's so easy to say, but so difficult to do.
It's hard to do.
Because how many of us that want to be entrepreneurs and creative professionals and musicians and whatever it is, how many of us that want to walk off the beaten path? You know, if you want to go down these routes, you're generally going to be a person that's a little bit more sensitive.
No, agree. But I mean, I think that's where, like, you know, you have to embrace your imposter side. And I am kind of an imposter right now. And so I have to embrace that. And this is where I'm at.
Yeah. So what I'm saying though is, like, we're telling people that are inherently, they had childhood experiences and experiences growing up where we're inherently the people that wanted validation but didn't necessarily get it. These are the people that go out and try to, it ties back to that study that you just said. Mm-hmm. Those of us that grew up with low self-esteem, we're the ones that are going out and trying to be the creatives and trying to push and being successful and doing all this. And so we're already highly trained and attuned to want validation because we didn't get it.
No, you're right. And that's what makes it more challenging, because you have a personal goal in mind, like, you know, establishing a business or being a really good photographer. But then it's that inward journey of self-validation and self-worth and developing that worth along the way.
Yeah.
And that's where I think that's the hardest part of the journey.
One of the things that helped me tremendously in this was, again, some of the people that I've surrounded myself with have helped me a lot in these areas, but was, you know, I have a friend, his name is Lee Morris and Patrick Hall. They run another website called F-Stoppers, and we're really close friends, but we started hanging out several years back. And I remember the very first time that Lee was describing one of my photographs, and we were doing a competition, and he's like, dude, that is an absolute piece of shit. And I was like, you're right, Lee. It is. But I kind of was thinking of, you know, in that moment, I was wondering if someone told me that early in my journey, it would have been really, really difficult, because I needed the validation. I craved it. But then you get to a certain point of comfort and security where you know that you are going to do things that suck from time to time. And not everybody needs to like your work, even the good stuff. And so, I don't know, this concept of validation, I love it. You're absolutely right. But I'm going to say, from the creative standpoint, it's so incredibly difficult.
No, but it's redefining the type of validation. Like, that feedback was validating, like, this is where you're kind of at right now.
It is. If you're hypersensitive to hearing something like that.
But it's the work through and owning that. Like, you know, when I was first starting out working with a psychiatrist, and I wasn't properly trained. So he was like, I gave a diagnosis on a client. I did the assessment, the presentation, and he straight up looked at me and he's like, dude, you seriously don't know shit, huh? Like, it was really demeaning. Like, I was like, what? And I was like, dude, and he's like, you don't know shit, do you? And then he gave me like this look and he's like, I want you to explain to me right now the differential diagnosis of bipolar disorder, schizoaffective, and schizophrenia, right? And then I was like, and then I was like, whoa, like this. And he's like, give me the differentiation right now, right? And then when I couldn't do it, he's like, you don't know shit. And he's like, you're gonna have to learn that right now you don't know shit, but you're gonna have to learn. And I was like, I'm gonna have to learn.
Yeah.
And that was humbling, because I wanted to be like, no, I know stuff. But that was the starting point that I had to learn and be like, no, teach me everything I need to know.
Well, that gets back to also, you know, you can get a real quick gauge of yourself, where you're at in terms of your development, by how you respond to those moments of criticism.
And being humble, and then all that defensiveness and hurt. When I left, I had to own all of it, but it was true.
Yeah.
And I had to sit there and eat my Oreos, man.
In your pool.
In the pool.
I'm in my
of
pool of
self-doubt.
Oreos.
In the heart of danger, cussing out Bruce Lee, right? So that whole thing. So
it'd be great if the Oreo pool analogy was the same way that we all approach this, because then we'd have very visual guides as to how much each of us are wallowing in self-doubt, right? You just look and you're like, Glenn, you've been in that self-doubt pool for a while now.
There's a lot of Oreos in your stomach right now, man.
No, this is that validation piece. That's a big one. And I do, from the aspect of like knowing where we are at, I think that joining a community where you can receive critique is a really important piece of this, because, you know, as you're trying to overcome this imposter syndrome, part of this is accepting what this is, that the positive side of imposter syndrome, and being okay with not being perfect, being okay with being wrong, being okay with this is a journey, this is a process. So if you can be in a peer group where you can receive criticism, that can help you in terms of being open to this process, to this journey of self-critique and balancing out this idea of, you know, imposter syndrome.
But it's embracing everything though. Like imposter syndrome means that you're challenging yourself, but internally you're making yourself more vulnerable. And then through that process of addressing your vulnerability, you become less vulnerable. You become stronger, genuinely.
Yeah.
Right. And then that's where the validation becomes more internal.
Okay. The last piece that you had here was to retrain your brain to focus on the positive, creating a success checklist and writing all your wins each night.
Yeah. So instead of just focusing on all the things that didn't work out every day, these are the successes I had. These are the wins that I had. So you're more focused on the good things that you're doing. Because most of the time the brain is wired to be more negative, and it focuses on all the negative things. So if you just let it go, it'll focus on all the 20 things that went wrong versus the 30 things that went right. Yeah. So it's just training yourself to focus on the positives more than the negatives.
That's an interesting one, because you're 1000% right. Like, again, why do I'm going to tell you why I like to talk about jiu-jitsu.
It's humbling.
It is humbling, number one. But I like to talk about new arenas where I'm always going to pick something in my life that's completely new, that just forces me completely outside of my comfort zone. And right now it's jiu-jitsu. In the past, it was racing cars. And each of these arenas kind of like, it reminds me of what it is to be new at something again, and how you approach questions and what kind of questions. It helps me to be a better educator, a better teacher, a better writer, a better everything, because I can understand where people are coming from. But the other side of this too, you know, in those new areas, you get to see all these things play out in an exaggerated form. Like this idea of, you know, creating a success checklist, and you telling me that, yeah, our brains kind of focus more on the failures. We all do that, right? We all focus more on the negative than the positive. This is why headlines are written to be what they are, because a negative headline that just exaggerates is going to get clicked more than, you know, this positive little thing that happened. So I think back to jiu-jitsu, and I'm like, man, when Glenn says that, last night, I can think of every one of my losses. And I can even think of how I was criticizing myself. Oh, this guy wasn't even as experienced and I lost to him. This guy did this and I lost to him. And I completely wrote off all the people that I beat last night, including the ones that were like higher belts. They didn't count. The only ones that mattered were the losses.
The negatives, yeah. Because that's how the brain is wired. It's wired for survival. And so when you're talking about quality of life things, you need to train your brain to focus more on the positives.
Yeah.
Like even like our phones, they mimic the racing thoughts, because behavioral psychologists, like when you go through your news feeds, they mimic the negative racing thoughts that you have, because that's what they know that your brain does that.
Yeah.
So it's just wiring you to just stay in this negative state the whole time.
And it like strengthens that muscle. Like it strengthens that response, basically.
Right. So you really need to focus more on the positives and your wins, because that's going to motivate you to keep going.
Yeah. So the last little piece that I was going to add was, this is why I talk about jiu-jitsu. This is why that I do things that are new and different, because they honestly tie back to that imposter syndrome. They tie back to my ability to overcome. Like, whenever I jump into these new arenas and I see how good people are at those things, and I got to start from ground zero again, it's that same process. What am I doing here? Why do I even belong here? What are the steps that I need to do to get to this next place? How can I do this? And with enough of these experiences, this is why I would encourage everybody. It doesn't have to be jujitsu. Just my last little tip is always be trying something new. You should, if you've been in one field for 10 years and you've mastered that thing and you don't have imposter syndrome anymore, what you said at the beginning was beautiful. This is your guidepost. Imposter syndrome is telling you that you're on a path that's going to lead you to growth. And if you don't feel it, you're in your comfort zone. So my last thing is to do new things. Try things that are new and embrace them, and remind yourself of this process over and over, because ultimately repeating this is what's going to make you better at managing it 5 years, 10 years down the road.
Yeah, and when you challenge yourself, imposter syndrome will show up, but it's just a sign that you're being courageous.
I'm on the right path.
You're on the right path.
I'm doing the thing that I should be doing. I'm doing the thing that's going to get me to grow to the next step.
And you should applaud yourself for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't ignore it. It's a good thing. I liked this episode. This was fun.
Thanks, man. Me too.
I wasn't thanking you, but
That was a good one. We touched toes. We
touched toes quite a few times. I am thanking you. I'm just teasing. Yeah. All right. We hope you guys enjoyed the episode. If you would like to help out Dr. Glenn and I, you can do so without paying a single dime. What we'd love for you to do is actually to hop onto the iTunes store and leave a positive review for the 12-Week Relationships podcast. So if you found it useful, go leave a positive review. If you didn't find it useful, negative reviews don't really help us out that much. So
just DM them.
Yeah, DM us. You can crap all over all of us in our DMs. But you know what you can also do is, if you jump on a 12-Week Relationships on Instagram, you can actually direct message me and Dr. Glenn, asking ideas. If there's topics that you guys want to bring onto the podcast, you guys have critique, what you guys want discussed, let us know. We love to incorporate those into our episodes as we go. And other than that, on 12weekrelationships.com, we do have individual coaching and couples coaching programs. They're 12-week programs that are available where you can work one-on-one with Dr. Glenn. And there's a free consult where you can sign up. Dr. Glenn can hop on the phone and walk through kind of what this program can do for you, for your relationships, for you individually, as well as if you are a couple, what it can do for you as a couple.
Yes.
And that's it.
That's it.
All right, dude, fist bump. One last touch, and we're out.
Thank you.
Peace.